claim to have cut our emissions by 300 million tonnes, and we're importing 180 million tonnes of emissions, which we don't count. And if you balance those out, we've made very little cuts.
What a really interesting discussion following, capital through the energy transition.
Global emissions have increased by 1 trillion tonnes since 1990. So no one is following the UK, okay? No one's even noticing us.
I'm Dipesh Patel, editor at Trade Treasury Payments. Despite all the talk about electricity and renewables, almost 80% of the UK's energy consumption comes from coal, oil and gas. In fact, gas alone is 40% of total UK energy consumption. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Catherine McBride, CEO of the Great British Business Council, to discuss her recently launched paper, Premeditated Industrial Destruction. Catherine, welcome to TTP Studios.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here.
Such a pleasure. You argue, Catherine, that UK energy policy is driving deindustrialisation. So where are those supply shifts actually moving, and who is financing that shift?
Well, some of them are being financed by the UK companies themselves, and not just UK companies. A lot of European companies have also, they now manufacture all around the world, which does reduce their transport costs, and it's got a lot of benefits to it. But one of the reasons they're going is we've made the cost of production here very expensive. I wrote this book based on statistics that were before the recent increase in wages. So I'm not actually talking about the wage costs, but we have now also got the employment bill, which is giving new rights to employed people, as well as higher minimum wages, which is adding to it. But the big cost started in 2005 when we started adding a cost on our carbon emissions. And while that sounds like a good idea, most of our trade partners did not have the same costs added to their carbon emissions. So Europe kind of started its own deindustrialisation. It suddenly became much cheaper to import goods made from Asia, not just because of the wage differential, but also because you didn't have to pay for the carbon emissions. Now, a lot of companies, especially in China, they're doing they're making their own goods. It's not just European countries operating out of China or India or Vietnam or Bangladesh or many, many countries. This is not, I don't want to point the finger at China. Even Japan didn't have any costs on its carbon when we first started doing that. Now, rather incredibly, the EU and the UK are talking about putting what they call a carbon border adjustment mechanism on imported goods to equalise the carbon costs between the carbon costs in the UK or Europe and the carbon costs in other countries. But that's a bit late. They're doing this 20 years too late. They should have done it when they introduced the carbon costs themselves. They should have happened at the same time if they were going to do it at all, because then you not so much protect European industries, but at least they're on the same ballpark. You're not letting people just move their chemical factory to some other country. So they sort of blew it there. But the essence of the paper is there's a lot of industries that really rely on oil and gas. Gas is, as said in the paper, it's about 40% of our total energy mix, and that we're still using it primarily to heat homes. And they've realised that we just don't have enough electricity to turn all the homes onto electric heating, which was the idea at one stage. And now everyone's realised that modern life consumes more and more energy, not less and less. And so we're going to have to start choosing whether we want to have things like data centres and AI operating in the UK, or if we want to start converting all of our cars, which mainly use petrol and diesel, and all of our houses onto electricity, which is much more expensive because of the taxes we put on it. Our production of electricity is not more expensive than European countries, but our industrial electricity is lumped with all sorts of taxes that often subsidize domestic electricity. Our politicians made a choice that, people, domestic ratepayers, they vote, and companies don't get a vote. So they pushed all of the costs onto the companies without realizing what a difference this would make between the cost of production in the UK and the cost of production in, say, Germany or France. There is a very helpful graph in the paper, just with in the section on steel, talking about the various costs of producing steel with electricity, because rather insanely, we've decided to move pretty much all of our steel making onto electric arc furnaces. And this is quite old technology. They had this in Australia when I was studying economics. The first electric arc furnace arrived. This is the 80s. So the idea that this is somehow new, it's not new. It's been around for a long time. The reason the UK never did it is its electricity costs were too expensive. They are still too expensive. So this is not going to work. It's only going to, in fact, there's already one electric arc furnace which has gone out of business. The only one that's surviving is just doing rebarb for construction work. So it's using it's recycling steel, which is a great idea. All metal should be recycled, all as much as possible. But with making rebarb, you don't have to purify it at all, really. Rebarb it's pretty basic stuff. And the other one has a contract with the Ministry of Defence. So they have a definite market for the stuff they're producing. So they're less concerned about the electricity costs. But the commercial one, Liberty, that went out of business. And I suspect the people at Tata, when they look at the costs of converting Port Talbot into an electric arc furnace, are going to do the same numbers and come up with the same result and go, well, that makes no sense.
Would you say banks and investors are effectively arbitraging energy policy, i.e., funding production in cheaper jurisdictions instead of the UK? And what would you say, to what extent is the UK actually reducing emissions versus simply importing them through global trade flows?
Well, there's a fantastic chart in the paper as well that we claim to have cut our emissions by 300 million tonnes, and we're importing 180 million tonnes of emissions, which we don't count. So we're just going, oh, look how much we've cut without, look how much we're bringing in. And if you balance those out, we've made very little cuts. Our biggest reduction in carbon emissions came when we converted our electricity production from coal to gas. And that happened because it was economically viable to do that. There was no rules. It mainly happened in the 90s. There were no rules saying you had to do that. There were no carbon taxes saying you forcing people to do that. People did it because it was economically viable to do that. It made more sense. And that's what we've got to get back to. We've got to get back to doing the things that make economic sense, not because we're forcing them with a lot of regulation and a lot of taxes, because then you tend to get the worst option becomes the predominant option rather than getting the economically sensible option. So we cut a lot of our emissions with that. And we also cut emissions by getting better landfill. Most people don't understand that most methane emissions came from landfill. They don't come from
Not the
cows.
cows.
Cows back, this cut I think is from 1990 as well. It's come down by 70%. And cows even then were only about 10% of our total emissions. And they're still about the same. They haven't changed much. They got better at dealing with slurry, which was giving off a lot of emissions as well. But mostly it's about landfill. And by doing that, we did a major cut there. But the other cut we've made is basically deindustrializing the UK and exporting our industry to other countries and then importing the product back. And that seemed like such a great idea when all people were happy to export all goods. That's all changing now because a lot of countries which is very good. I'm very pleased about this, but a lot of countries are developing and their own population are going, well, hang on a second, we'll buy those cars or we'll buy those washing machines or we'll have that stuff. So they don't need to export everything. So countries that set up their entire economy around
Mm.
exports, and you look at sort of South Korea as a fantastic example of that. There's a point where they become wealthier and they start buying their own goods. And, Japan did the same thing, obviously a long time ago, but it's also become a big consumer of its own goods as well as an exporter, where when after the Second World War, it was all about exports and they had very tight currency controls. South Korea had exceptionally tight currency controls right through, I think, till the 90s. It was quite, just to get that industry going. And I predict that, the same thing could happen to Vietnam and
Mm.
Bangladesh and a whole lot of countries that we're just assuming they're always going to keep supplying us with stuff. And you're going, well, there's going to be a point when they start supplying themselves instead,
Mm.
or they find another, country that can pay more. That's happened to a lot of those Southeast Asian producers. Is China's now one of their big markets, and so Europe in general may find that life changes, because there is an assumption in all economic trade theory,
Yeah.
and I was a flag waver for this for a long time, uh, that all things are always available. And the caveat to that no one mentions is at a price. So all things are always available, but at a price, and be prepared to pay for it. Um, and we may discover that isn't the case when suddenly, say, we rely on imported gas. Now, we mainly get gas from Norway. About 75% of the gas we import comes from Norway, and it's gas because we have a pipeline from it. But about 20% of the gas is coming from the US, and that's liquid natural gas.
Mhm.
And the rest is coming from countries like Qatar, was about 2%, and we got gas from Peru. We were getting gas from all sorts of other countries, which intrigues me that they've all got A, gas, and B, a plant to convert it to liquid natural gas.
Mm.
And the UK, despite having a huge amount of gas under the North Sea, does not have a plant to convert its gas to liquid natural gas. So when people start saying, oh, it's no point in getting more gas, we'll just sell it to the highest bidder, I would like to know how they're going to get the gas there, because it comes in a pipeline first to the UK, and what we don't use, we'll sell some to Ireland, and some will go to Denmark and to the Netherlands. But they're only pipelines, really. And if it goes on from the Netherlands, it can do that. It can go on to Germany. But uh, it's a fungible sort of thing. It's not necessarily ours because Norwegian gas comes in and the UK acts as a land bridge. So Norwegian gas will come to the UK and then it could end up in Ireland or the Netherlands. And because they're both out of the North Sea, I think it'd be very hard to pick the difference between them. There are other gases from around the world that have very big, different compositions, so that they have a lot more other products in with the methane.
Mm.
Natural gas is mainly methane, but they also have ethane and pentane and butane and other tanes in them. So they have to sort of either purify them to turn them into liquid natural gas to get them to different countries so you can probably tell the difference if it's coming in from LNG. But recently, with the war in Iran and Iran firing missiles into Qatar, which seemed like a crazy idea because I've always felt that Qatar was kind of on Iran's side, or at
Mm.
least a bit friendly towards Iran. But by doing that, so they obviously weren't trying to hurt Qatar so much as hurt the world that uses Qatari liquid natural gas. Which is also strange because one of the big users of that are the Asian countries, including China, which I also thought was meant to be a friend of
Hmm.
Iran. So, and Pakistan and India and countries that you'd think they'd want to keep on side, but they seem to not be interested in keeping them on side either. So it's a bit of a a Hail Mary, and then they also upset the Bahraini production refineries. So a lot of refined oil coming out of the Gulf has also disappeared. And unless other countries are able to pick up their production,
Mm.
there's going to be a major shortage of oil and gas, and people are going to have to pay a lot more for it.
Well, Catherine, and it's really interesting looking at, energy through the lens of that trade
Mm,
theory of, I think, comparative
yeah.
advantage. What would you say rising energy import dependence, e.g.,
Yeah.
here in the UK, means for trade and trade risk?
Well, it's very obviously you have a balance of trade, and so one of the reasons we export goods is to help us pay for goods we're importing, and that seems to have gone out the window recently. The UK has run a trade deficit for many many years, and though we do sell a lot of services which
Mm,
help, we don't sell enough services to make up for the goods trade deficit, and some of the trade problems we've got. Um, have will have a knock-on effect in other industries. For instance, one of the we gas is used to make ammonia, and ammonia is used to make fertilizer.
mhm,
The UK used to do that we had two fertilizer plants. One of them closed in 2022 when the gas price went up, and the other one now only uses imported ammonia. Now that's all well and good when you can import ammonia, but without that imported ammonia, they can't produce fertilizers. And if you can't produce fertilizers, then that will be a problem for farmers growing crops. It's the same, we have a shortage of diesel here because our refineries have concentrated on other products, and most of the diesel in Europe is made in Rotterdam because um, there's more refineries in
yeah.
Rotterdam than there are in the UK. The whole of the UK, one city in the Netherlands, has a bigger refinery capacity. And because there's a greater demand for diesel in Europe, they have always concentrated on making diesel. And we've got to hope they're going to keep selling it to us, which they probably will. But there are other countries around the world who are going to have similar problems. Australia and New Zealand are two obvious choices where they rely on imported diesel and probably imported fertilizer. And they are feeding a large proportion of the Asian continent now. Um, and that's worked out really well. They have the space and capacity to make a lot of food, and Asia is making a lot of industrial goods that they sell back to them. So that trade was really a good trade until suddenly there's a shortage of oil, which is going to make it harder for them to produce the food they need. And in the need to sell, rather
Mm,
not that they need
mm,
for themselves, but that they were supplying Asia with. And you'll find that in the UK, our farmers are probably okay this season because they will have ordered their fertilizer and taken delivery of it before now. In fact, most of them have already planted and so they're okay. But it will hit their next season. This is one of the problems with agriculture that a lot of people don't understand because we're so used to things being in the shops immediately when we need them. But someone has to think about producing them about a year before we get them in the shop. And this is also going to be a problem for the UK because we import a lot of food out of season from other places.
mm.
So, right now, apples in most of the supermarkets are coming from South Africa because it's their apple season and it won't be our apple season until the autumn. And we've been doing that for literally hundreds of years. The UK almost invented half of its colonies just to supply it with food. Um, and so you get, we have to look at not just our own growing season. And if we've got enough fertilizer, we're going
Mm.
to have to look at what's happening in other countries. Do they have fuel? Do they have fertilizer? If not, we're going to have shortages.
Catherine, let's talk about AI and data centers. And you talked about earlier the
Yeah.
energy implications and resource considerations. Are we here in the UK, would you say we're underestimating how those energy constraints will actually shape what is definitely going to be the next industrial wave for us?
Well, it's the industrial wave we expected to be involved in. because we do have a lot of entrepreneurs who are very good at this. And AI's language is English. We obviously all speak that. And it's uh, should be huge. And our chancellor is suggesting that this will be the next big thing in the UK and we'll get involved with this. But she's obviously not looked at the energy required to run a data center. And there are about 31 states in the US that have now banned data centers setting up in their state off the grid.
Mm.
They can come if they bring their own power, but they can't come and plug into the socket in the wall because that will disturb the balance in the grid. And the UK is going to be in exactly the same problem. We're already in danger of having blackouts, especially this summer, because we're relying so heavily on renewables that are intermittent. They can be very strong, they can be very weak. The sun, as we all know, the British summer is not something you can rely on. And so having a lot of solar panels isn't always a great thing. Our wind is sometimes so strong they have to pay people to turn it off, but they can't pay people to turn off solar if there's a lot of solar out there. So it's putting a lot of stress on the grid. People don't realize that the grid has to be managed second by second. There always has to be kept at 50 hertz, and there's a balancing program that goes on doing that. And the more variety of ways people are producing energy, the harder that balancing act is. And a lot of the things that we're relying on for electricity, such as the wind farms, which are out on,
Mm.
they're getting further and further away from the centres of demand because they're in Scotland, but they're not off the coast of Edinburgh or Glasgow. They're sort of off the coast of the northwest where no one lives, the Shetland Islands or somewhere. So, sorry, not no one. I know there's going to be an angry listener in the Shetland Islands saying, I'm here. But anyhow, we know you're there. But yeah, there's not a great demand for electricity. So we've got very high transmission costs. And everyone's talking about nuclear, and I'm a big fan of nuclear energy. However, it takes forever to build here. A lot of that is our regulation as well.
Mm.
So we're planning to have all this nuclear, and they've just signed a deal to put in 3 Rolls-Royce small nuclear reactors, the small modular reactors. And that's all well and good, but I don't think they're going to be operational for about 6 years. And data centers are looking for places to come now. So we have to find a way to produce more energy quickly. And unfortunately, even gas turbines, there's a waiting list for them now of about 8 years. So one of the things we've suggested in the book, which will intrigue people, is to bring back coal-fired electricity in the UK. Because coal-fired plants now are much more efficient than the ones that Alok Sharma was happily blowing up years ago, because those were very old plants that had been built a long time ago. Now they are much more efficient. The Chinese are building one within 2 years. It's I think 18 months to put up a coal-fired power station. They put up 78 last year, and they use it as a backup to their wind power, because coal is also quite quick to get going and turn it up and down, so that they are doing that, and we should consider that as well. In fact, the Chinese have done quite a large coal-fired power station that not only cleans out all of the NOx and the SOx and the pollutants that are real pollutants, but they're also collecting the carbon dioxide that comes off the plant so that they can use that in other things, because that's something the UK actually currently has a shortage of carbon dioxide.
Mhm.
So you sit there going, well, surely it's not beyond the capability of the engineers in the UK to work out how to do this and do it quickly, because that is the key element. We still have huge amounts of thermal coal. We still had a working thermal coal mine until 2 years ago, when it was closed because its license expired,
Mhm.
not because it was uneconomic. And it employed about 180 people in a small town in Wales. It was their sort of anchor employment. And we have one other working coal mine which produces anthracite. And anthracite is a very dense, high-carbon coal which is used to make graphene and graphite and things that are important in the battery technology. So that's really good coal, if you like. Everyone sort of lumps coal into one basket, but it goes from very poor quality coal, which is what they're using in Germany, and which is lignite, and it's only got about 3% carbon, 30% carbon rather, and it burns badly, produces a low amount of energy, and it really shouldn't be used. Now we could sell Germany our high quality thermal coal, which would be much better for the planet in general if we could just get over this aversion we have to hydrocarbons and start going, no, actually, they weren't the problem. The old factory might have been the problem. The chimney might have been the problem. The fact that we weren't collecting the gas that was coming off, we were just letting it go wherever we like. Um, we haven't looked at ways of making a more efficient production method as we did with cars. You know, the pollution that comes out of the back of a car, the tailpipe of a car, has gone down by 80% since the 1980s. And that mainly happened without regulation. It happened because the price of petrol went up and everyone wanted more efficient cars, and they got much more efficient. And now Porsche has actually spent a lot of money developing a car that runs on an even more efficient fuel. So they're pumping hydrogen into the petrol or diesel, whatever it was to begin with, to make it a much more efficient fuel. And that apparently they're burning cleanly in new engines. And that would probably be a much better thing for the UK to be permitting than to try and get everyone to go to EVs when we don't have enough electricity and we don't have the battery technology. We don't actually have the ability to make batteries here for the cars. We rely very heavily on them coming in from China. So it's kind of crazy that we've gone all in on an industry that we can't really make and ignore an industry that we have plenty of. We are one of only 40 countries in the world with ample amounts of hydrocarbons, both coal, oil, and gas. And right now, there's about 40 countries that are limiting their use of oil, coal, and gas because they can't get it. And it's almost embarrassing that we are so smug middle-class people that we would sit there going, oh, well, sorry about that. Sorry you haven't got any diesel, love to help out, but, we're saving the planet, so don't starve to death. We'll help you one of these days. It's unreal. It just beggars belief that we have two sites that are ready to go. You're both Jackdaw and Rosebank. They were given permission to operate in 2022, and even getting that permission took them about 15 to 20 years. But they got that permission, and then suddenly they were called back on some idea that this would influence global emissions, when global emissions have increased by 1 trillion tonnes since 1990. So no one is following the UK, okay? No one's even noticing us. But anyhow, so they pulled this back, and one of them, Jackdaw, which produces gas, and we can't export gas, as I explained earlier, so it's all coming into the UK, so it's definitely going to help us, all right? And it's all the structural stuff is done. They have drilled the well. They have done the tie back to another Shell station, which is not far away, so that they can. They've done that. They've built the big platform base that they need to over the well. So everything's ready to go, but they still think it should be up and running in 3 months. But instead, it may take longer because they might have to, even if Ed Miliband says, yes, that's okay, and he gives it support, it will have to go back through the approval process again, which is madness. It's like they've been through the approval process at least twice, maybe 3 times already. And suddenly this triggers another approval process, which gives the activists who just want us all to live on, I don't know, go back and live in caves, I suppose, they will have another go at trying to close these things down. And it just doesn't make any sense to me. The world needs oil and gas. We've got oil and gas. We should sell it to them. Well, the gas, we can't sell it to them till we build a plant, but no one will build a big LNG plant here. They cost, it'll cost them at least 6 billion US, maybe 10. Um, because if the government is intent on closing this industry down, no one's going to make that investment. Where Norway has every intention of keeping their industry going, so they have made that investment. They have built an LNG plant. And they are still producing oil and gas, which they sell everywhere, including, I knew they sold us 75% of the gas that we import, and we import about half of the gas we use. What I didn't know is they're also supplying us with 40% of the crude oil we're refining in our refineries. So when people say, oh, if we export, if we produce more oil, it'll just be exported. Well, it's being exported to Rotterdam, as I explained, where both BP and Shell have big refineries there, really big, much bigger than any of the refineries in the UK. And both BP and Shell will then export it back into the UK to, go in their petrol stations. But that's considered an export by the activists. So,
Yeah.
But meanwhile, where the other refineries are importing oil from Norway, so they're still using North Sea oil. It's just not UK North Sea oil. It's Norwegian North Sea oil. Sorry.
No,
Yeah,
no.
I'll
Well,
let you get a word in edgeways.
thank you very much. And look,
Yeah,
what a really interesting discussion following, capital through the energy transition. And you can read our readers can read the report, Premeditated Industrial Destruction, which is
yeah,
available now, and we'll share the link. And we've discussed, energy import dependence. We've discussed the resources required for AI and data centers. We've discussed nuclear. We've discussed coal-fired power stations. Some of the biggest contributions to methane. We've also discussed. So, Catherine McBride, thank you very much for joining us at TTP Studios. It's been such a pleasure having you here.
thank you very much.